I think I have about 35 minutes. I'm told to keep it to 12:40. So wherever I am, that's where I'll land. So I just have to make sure we cover everything. So we're going to go ahead and move forward. Thank you, Madeline, for that introduction. Okay, so this is the title, and this is me in action, and we'll talk about these different pieces later. I will be talking about this academic detailing program, which I have affectionately called ADOPS, which I'll share a little bit later. And this is the current FDA trial I have on opioid package prototypes. And so just keep this image in your mind as we move forward. So we will hopefully have some time to talk about that. So this is my outline. We're going to briefly talk about the objectives, which are familiar, I believe, for all of you, the journey and why, my toolbox, today's focus, some past work on opioids, my current work at UConn, and future directions. And if I have time, I will tell you about an even more interesting and exciting future direction. So we'll see if we have time for that. Okay, so I am a consultant for Otsuka Pharmaceuticals, mainly with their, as a speaker for their PsycU educational platform. And the reason why I felt a little bit more comfortable with this platform, because I don't typically do things for pharma, it's because it's a non-promotional online platform. It's available to clinicians regarding evidence-based concepts in mental health care. And so they have really great modules on measurement-based care and stuff like that. So anyway, that's sort of my role with Otsuka. I have no other conflicts to discuss. And by the way, just a small administrative detail. Madeline will be keeping track of the chat. So feel free to ask questions. I can't see the chat. So if you do have some questions, maybe we'll address them towards the end. So here are some objectives. I believe all of these are familiar to you. I will just note that the first question will be kind of talking about the second objective. And then the second question will be the last objective. So I'm covering all the objectives, but you'll see these questions popping through that kind of not in any particular order of objectives, but you'll see that I cover them. So I just want to talk a little bit about my journey, and I actually provided this slide. One thing I did mention, I'm actually going up for full professor this year. Hopefully we'll hear soon about that effort. But part of the next couple of slides are a part of my my tenure and promotion presentation, or well, it's promotion presentation. So, I have had a long-term interest in how intervention design can structure communications to have an impact on pharmacists' behaviors and patient outcomes. And I also should say, this is not just also, just pharmacists, but also other clinicians. So you will see how some of the tools I will be talking about will can also be applied to physicians, since I know there's other types of clinicians in the audience. So just know that this is relevant to many types of clinicians. And really, we know from looking at program fidelity that the effectiveness of a program is only as good as we consistently engage in that effort. So overall hypothesis of the work is improvement in intervention structure and accountability will lead to greater consistency, behaviors, and improved patient outcomes. And I will show you examples of that as we go. But the overall model is very old. It's called the Donabedian model, which is saying that there's this relationship between structure and its impact on process, and process impacts outcomes. And those outcomes ultimately can change the structure. So while this is a linear depiction, you can imagine that there's a circular interactions between these components. So this was my overall model I presented. I don't want to spend really much time on this, but you can sort of see on the left side, I've been focused on where I've done some work, and where you see a letter is there's a paper or two that is related to that. And so I tried to put my entire research program in this kind of a diagram something I recommend to people who are going up for tenure and promotion, because it really does give a useful conceptualization of the research. So this is really kind of, if you look at it, it's sort of the structure on the left side, sort of the processes in the middle, and the outcomes on the right side. And this is the many papers that relate to those different pathways. Again, happy to share some of this in a future presentation. So what is my toolbox? And you will see that unravel as I talk about these different projects. You know, survey methodology is common in many of these projects. I've also delved into, I wouldn't call myself a big expert in qualitative techniques, but I've done some focus groups, I've done some interviews, so I have that as a part of my toolbox. I would say I do a fair bit with, quantitative analysis of surveys and so forth, which is really common to the social administrative sciences. And many of you who are on this call come from this tradition of the social administrative sciences, so you're very familiar with this toolkit. And these health behavior theories are a part of that toolkit. So I want to start talking about what is the first of a few projects that I'm going to kind of briefly talk about today, and hopefully to stimulate some interests in this space. So when I was at Northeastern, so I've been at UConn now for will be 5 years shortly, and I was at Northeastern University in Boston. I began to really catch on to this opioid misuse problem, and I'm trying to avoid the word abuse, because we've trying to move away from that and the stigmatizing language. So if I do accidentally use it, I am apologizing up front. Although I will tell you that the National Institute on Drug Abuse has an identity problem now that they have to actually maybe think about maybe changing it to a different term, which many in my field have proposed. So in terms of the aims, I wanted to really get stakeholders' input, in particular pharmacists, pharmacy managers, some regulators, all together and say, what would be a good algorithm to kind of allow us community pharmacists to systematically approach the detection and in-store management of suspected prescription abuse misuse. And then to also evaluate pharmacists and other stakeholder feedback about the algorithm. So develop the algorithm and then get feedback. And then the question is, what community pharmacists and other stakeholders consider as the first steps needed to detect and intervene on prescription drug misuse? So again, I'm not going to go over this, but this was sort of, in Boston area, I had one discussion group, and then we kind of developed, I basically gave them an algorithm to react to, and they kind of brought up different issues with it. We kind of further modified it. Then we had another discussion group actually out in the western part of Massachusetts, where we got additional feedback by community pharmacists. And then we kind of did some more tweaking, and then actually did some brief interviews. We got a lot of different feedback. And these are some of the interview questions that we asked, kind of like, where do you think the pharmacist and technician divide should be? For example, what do you think are pharmacist roles in this process? What do you think are technician roles? What do you think about technicians being delegates of looking up the PMP? And then just a number of questions here. And so anyway, getting them to react to the algorithm. And this is kind of the algorithm that we developed. This was published in Research in Social Administrative Pharmacy. There's a red color for sort of a warning to stop, a yellow sort of caution, and then the greens. We tried to use the traffic light concept, which, as many of you know, is popular in different public health, education, information messaging. And so sort of the big thing is, obviously, when we teach students, we're asking them to determine whether a prescription is authentic, and then if they're unsure, what to call the doctor to check it out. If it's forged, obviously contacting the police. If it's not, then going into the PMP and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit, but there's some yellow boxes that I kind of added that I haven't seen in many other algorithms, which is not just looking at the PNP and that be the end of the story, but actually say, well, do they appear through the profile or observing the patient that they might be misusing the medication? And we'll talk about those in a few moments. Or what's the situation with the insurance? Are they paying cash? Did the insurance reject? Do they have multiple insurance payment options? Different things that you can look at and that might help determine whether they might be misusing. And again, contacting the prescriber. And then there's just this whole set of algorithms around what to do if you aren't able to get a hold of the prescriber, real practical things, because many of you know it's hard to get a hold of doctors. What do you do if you get into that situation? And it kind of takes you all the way through. So here on this slide, you see with table 2, you're reviewing the prescription, opioid prescription for completeness. This is determining its authenticity. For table 3, we're looking at this kind of profile review where you're looking at the number of prescribers. The PMP actually does some of this already for you in terms of looking at multiple doctors, multiple pharmacies. And here were some additional pieces. Is the person receiving a large amount of morphine equivalent of the medication? Is that some, maybe a red flag? Are they receiving also benzodiazepines? Observing someone, do they look like they have slurred speech? Are they you're unable to have a logical conversation with them? So these are additional monitoring things that you could explore. So I just want to sort of end on this study a little bit, talking about what we saw as some key themes. And some of them are hopefully somewhat obvious, but there were a few things that I came away with that I was a little surprised by. Opioid misuse detection starts with prescription authenticity. I don't think many of us would disagree with that. And then, there was a lot of debate, and I still remember it to this day. Many of the community pharmacists actually said, you know what, we don't use the PMP right away. We actually use the insurance. And if it rejects it, we don't give it to them. Or, and so that means that a lot of people who are paying cash are going to maybe folks that they're particularly concerned about, or they may be missing the opportunity to intervene. They'll say, oh, it's got rejected, we're not going to help those folks. So I was a little bit concerned by some of that, and I wondered why they didn't want to use the PMP right away. And they said, well, it's cumbersome, it takes a lot of time. As many of you know, the prescription drug monitoring programs have really improved over the years. So hopefully, and I can tell you in the state of Connecticut, I think at least 90 to 95% of the prescribers are enrolled in the PMP. Pharmacists have really improved. I would say it's definitely in the 70 to 80% getting there. So we're seeing more enrollment in PMP. But again, making that extra step, going in, checking it, because a lot of times they're in 2 different systems and they have to make different clicks and so forth. The idea that they all agreed that the clinical profile and the observation piece was important. And they really thought that the red, green, and the coloring did help a bit. But also came up was that they're really uncomfortable talking to patients about their misuse or their suspected misuse. And so we have to do some homework on that. So anyway, it got me thinking a little more about how might we use the algorithm in practice. I can tell you the algorithm has not been yet used in practice. It's been brought up by a number of people along the way that are interested in something like this that might be some structure for practitioners. But I don't know how feasible it is, if it could be incorporated into software, different things like that. And also, looking at what are patient and organizational factors that influence pharmacists' opioid dispensing and intervention decisions. So, we definitely need to see more work around the development of decision support aids that can really guide community pharmacists in these challenging, unclear situations, because it really catches them often, off guard, uncomfortable, and just having an algorithm might really help them through some of that confusion and concern. So I think that's where we are here with our first question. And I think Madeline is going to do a poll, and there we are. Okay, I don't know. I think we probably have given folks maybe enough time. So I'm going to go ahead and give you the answer. Obviously, the first one really doesn't make much sense as a first step, because you're really you're not going to call the doctor, if it's legitimate, there's no flags, but they're paying cash. I don't think that would be your first step. Calling the prescriber, most pharmacists are not going to call a doctor and take their time regarding potential risks for future opioid misuse. Really, it's C is the correct answer that we just talked about. And again, you really want to call the, so looks like, let's see, we have here. You're not going to just call the doctor after checking the PMP. You're going to hopefully go through some other assessments and so forth. And plus, I didn't necessarily say that what you found on the PMP was necessarily negative. So, all right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. There we go. All right, so just want to shift to a project now. So that was a little bit of like pre-UConn kind of thing. And now, since being at UConn, I've really been, and I'm still heavily involved in this project. It's actually ongoing. We have now had 2 or 3 grants out of it. And basically, many of you are probably familiar, in particular if you're connected with a VA, on the value of academic detailing, which is essentially educational outreach that's one-to-one, evidence-based, and it's not promotional. It's really where a clinician talks to another clinician and actually tries to get them to consider changing their behavior based on some evidence practice guidelines and so forth. So it's really not promotional. So, one of the things that we were been concerned of is remember I mentioned that doctors and pharmacists are getting more enrolled in the PMP, which in Connecticut, our PMP is called the Connecticut Prescription Monitoring and Reporting System. But how do you get them to use it more consistently? So that's the next step, is also you're in there, but now use it. So we decided that we needed to do some more one-to-one kind of outreach. Now you might say, well, what's wrong with public, these big CE programs and big, public health messaging and so forth. Well, we have a big change to script program in Connecticut, but the challenge is that, people are often multitasking when they're seeing these messages. They're not as focused, where if you have one-to-one interpersonal connection with the prescriber, it may be more impactful, certainly something worthwhile to explore. So anyway, we have now a module on the prescription drug monitoring program. These are brief. Academic detailing are brief visits. They're brief visits, 20 minutes. And we have a whole action plan that's really what the detailer is supposed to cover. And by the way, I might note the detailers in this project, I have another detailing project that does involve pharmacists, but the detailers in this program are health district staff. So they're health educators that work for different health districts throughout the Nutmeg State. So anyway, I think that that's kind of a different piece, and that those health district staff are going to pharmacies, are going to doctors and talking about these different topics. So what I think is really neat is it's bringing the health community and the health district community to these sites and having a conversation. So we really wanted to see, is this feasible and effective approach? So again, I talked a little bit about all of these basic concepts. If you want to, for those of you who are familiar with motivational interviewing, you'll have some sense of academic detailing, because motivational interviewing is behavioral change, how to talk in a way that gets the patient to, and in this case the clinician, to take ownership of that behavior and say, hey, I really want to do this, and I really want to see some change. So anyway, this is the overall spirit of academic detailing. So we have several health districts involved throughout the state. We've developed now modules on the Connecticut prescription monitoring reporting system and naloxone. And actually, we also have now an MAT on medication-assisted treatment. What's really cool about this, you might say, well, why would a doctor take time for a health district staff to come and talk to them? Well, guess what? They don't have to leave their office. They're going to get CE, just like you're getting it now during your lunch hour. They get it by just meeting with the health district staff. Wow, bring it right to the prescriber. And a lot of the physicians have really they love this. And by the way, we have targeted prescribers who are often physicians, but also nurse practitioners, physician assistants, and we're also going to pharmacies, and we have a number of pharmacies that have been detailed. And we have all kinds of packets. You saw on my first slide some of the stuff that we hand out, a folder. It has the ADOPS. By the way, we call it academic detailing for opioid safety, so ADOPS. And we have pens, and we give little, things, reminders. And we put everything on flash disks, so they have electronic version, which, by the way, I may add, came in really handy with virtual, because we had to pivot to virtual, right? Just like we're all now on this screen, we had to make sure that there was virtual academic detailing, which has been done in a number of health districts. But, although I will tell you, still our health district staff have been able to get out and do one-to-one in-person visits despite COVID. So anyway, this is an example of an action plan with the CPRMS module. And so you can see how I have learning objectives up there, much like we talked about today. But I actually have a checklist, and this goes on for about 3 or 4 pages, where during visit 1 or visit 2 or visit 3, they're supposed to check off what they cover. Again, that gives intervention structure. It makes sure that I can count on the fact that the health district staff, wherever they are, they're going to cover these concepts. They're going to explore facilitators and barriers. And on another pages, I have them identify goals. And so and when they come back during the 2nd and 3rd visit, there's usually about 2 to 3 visits with each module, that they are actually following up. Hey, you said you were going to put up maybe a poster or a sign about this or that, or you were going to bring on a delegate to check the PMP. How are you doing on that? So it's intended to really follow up on that stuff. Okay, so here's some of the ADOPS materials, some of the posters that have been done. Just really neat to see some of this. And this is a real partnership between the actually 3 agencies. The Division of Consumer Protection, our Department of Drug Control is within that agency, and then also with the Department of Public Health and the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services, or as affectionately known as DMHAS, which is in your below in the bottom screen. So we've done a number of visits. I did all the training, and we just very positive. Most scores out of 10 are really about 8 or 9, about attendees' feelings about the detailer and their, how receptive their experience with the detailer, and really learning a lot. But we've also assessed the prescriber and pharmacist knowledge. And most of them performed really well on their knowledge assessments. So again, we have some data. We're continuing to collect more data, but some of it's really encouraging. So I think that leads us to our next question. So this is a little tricky, but I think you guys are hopefully eating and having your coffee, so you'll be able to catch some of the distinctions here. So why don't we go ahead and close the poll, and let's see how people responded. All right, my job is done here. You guys got it. All right, so that question probably was a little bit maybe easier than the first one. So yes, that's the correct answer. Great. Okay, so we're going to now move on to another project. Okay, so this one I'm not going to talk as long, and we don't have an objective, or rather a question on this, a poll question. So I do want to make sure we get through all our poll questions. So I just wanted to highlight that in July of 2016, and a number of states have done something similar, where they allowed prescribers not have to search the PMP prior to opioid prescribing if they prescribe less than a 72-hour amount. Now, so this is an incentive to prescribers. Hey, you don't have to go to that cumbersome PMP. You can, if you prescribe less days supply, you know what, you can bypass it. So this is almost like an incentive to not have to do something that you really don't want to take the time to do, is actually to do something that's hopefully a little more favorable in terms of curtailing the amount that gets prescribed. And there hasn't really been a lot of evaluation on this. And so we kind of looked at opioid prescription volume, benzodiazepine, morphine milligram equivalents, day supply, and to see how search rates, which is looking up the PMP. So we'll talk a little bit about this. I mean, we would propose that the opioid regulation would be associated with a decrease in opioid prescription volume, because you would think that there would be less amount prescribed, and you would also see a decrease in search rates, because people would just not look up the PMP. We had benzodiazepine because we wanted to sort of have like a little control, because the regulation had only to do with opioids, it had nothing to do with benzos. So we were just kind of curious about that. We get our data from APRIS, which many states do. And again, we looked at a number of these variables. We kind of developed a pre-regulation period from January 2016 to July 26, and sort of a post-regulation for a much longer period. And then we kind of compared some pre-post guideline and see if we had any impact. A lot of data cleaning was necessary. Unfortunately, the data you often get from these software companies is a little messy. So just some brief results, and we're still kind of trying to put the paper together on this. And so basically, we saw a statistically significant decrease of opioid prescription volume, which kind of goes in the direction of our hypothesis. We were surprised to see the benzo change, because we would not have hypothesized that, because the regulation had nothing to do with the benzo. However, we did. So maybe this is other public health interventions that are going on at the time. And by the way, this makes this whole research of public health research very messy, because there's a number of interventions going on at the state. We just looked at one piece, so a lot of it can be clouded. It's really hard to control for these other things that are going on. We didn't see any difference when you looked at the morphine milligram equivalent, which was interesting, maybe that way of normalizing opioid dosing. actually caused there to be no statistically significant difference. And we saw no difference in day supply of the opioid and benzo day supply. We did see some differences, however, with search rates, that we saw search rates much higher pre than post, which is kind of what we thought would happen, because we would think that people weren't looking up the PMP. So it kind of raises a lot of questions, so we found support for opioid prescription volume and prescriber search rates having declined, and that there was no change in day supply as we had hypothesized. But it kind of rejected some of our notions in terms of no change with opioid prescription day supply and MME and benzodiazepine day supply. We found a significant decrease. But again, that may be a result of other public health efforts that are going on. So we kind of wondered, one thing, for example, I had a note here, maybe I wonder if doctors were prescribing more potent opioids, and therefore that's why we didn't see the change in MME. Those are some things to think about. So just some questions to explore. Okay, I now am at, let's see, 12:36. I will try to get through as what I can. I know we're going to try to wrap up fairly soon, so I'll go through this. This study, I just want to tell you, it was a survey study that was just, in fact, if I showed you my other screens, I have a galley proof that I have to look at. And this was the one that I did with yours very wonderful student, and you should be very proud of LaDon. But LaDon, Karim Nejad, and I did this work together along with another colleague. And anyway, we wanted to really look at how, one thing that's really cool about our PMP is that it is integrated with their marijuana, medical marijuana data. And most PMPs don't have that integration, but we do. So anyway, this was just a survey where we were looking at, what the perceptions of it. So I'm not going to go through the survey construction. Unfortunately, and believe me, it wasn't LaDon and rather our team, it was actually a little bit before LaDon. We tried to really get as many people to respond to the survey. We did get about 12 dispensary pharmacists, which if they came from, at least I think we determined they came from 5 or 6 dispensaries, which was almost half of the dispensaries that were available at the time. So in that sense, that's not a bad response rate on the dispensary side. Certainly we have many more pharmacists than 178. So, one thing, just to kind of just big, broad statements here is that the community-based pharmacists, that's CBPs, they, what I found interesting is they would typically use the PMP. Well, actually, many reported not using the CPMRS or the PMP, in particular for determining medical marijuana use, referring a patients to substance misuse support. So maybe that's not surprising to folks, but I think there's a real missed opportunity there. So that was a little concerning. And it doesn't surprise me that they're not using the medical marijuana dispensary, because they don't typically dispense and prescribe naloxone. So that makes some sense there. And then this was really an interesting piece that both groups reported less use of the PMP or the CPMRS for clinical value, such as drug interactions, risk of side effect. So in terms of the clinical use of the PMP, it wasn't used as much. Another big finding, and I think maybe it was on this slide, yeah, a greater percentage of MMDPs than the community-based pharmacists use the CPMRS for both opioid and marijuana information. The community-based pharmacists were not looking in the PMP for the marijuana information, but the marijuana dispensary pharmacists were looking into the PMP for both opioid and marijuana information. Interesting. So And there may be all kinds of reasons why that is. It's actually the dispensaries are required to actually look at the PMP as a part of their evaluation of a patient's eligibility for medical marijuana. So anyway, just some key thoughts there. Let's see, I think that's one of the things that was also informative here was that respondents indicated the need for the PMP improvements in terms of rapid updating of opioid dispensing information, the clarity of where the opioids were dispensed, specificity of the medical marijuana information. By the way, there's a really unique opportunity with the medical marijuana to actually begin to collect outcomes with this dispensing information. So anyway, we're excited by this. This is kind of the first known study exploring the differences in perceptions of community-based pharmacists and medical marijuana dispensary pharmacists regarding the integrated marijuana and opioid PMP. So anyway, I think that we sort of spoke to that. So I think we're now to our next question, and I'll probably just go through the last one sort of quickly, the last project. I know we're at time, but maybe just a couple more minutes if it's okay. Okay, so let's call the poll. This one, because we kind of went through kind of quickly, I may be able to help you with. Yes, and I'm glad that nobody picked the first one. That's correct, and very few people picked D. So where maybe if I had a little more time, I would have really highlighted. But actually, my point was that the integrated system really didn't have much information regarding strain, THC content. So that was actually a limitation of the integrated system. But certainly, as I mentioned, the MMDPs do use the integrated system quite a bit for opioid information. Okay. All right, well, let's wrap up with the last project, and I'll make this quick, although I have a feeling it's probably going to be the one that you're most interested in. But if we have time, we can always get into that a little later. So I have this current FDA project, which has been a bit delayed because of COVID for obvious reasons, that the clinics were closed for a while. We're getting ready to go into clinics fairly soon, actually. But, you know, the idea of developing and I had told it, oh yeah, so I don't know if folks can see me. Well, with my screen on, you may not be able to, but there's a packaging prototype here that I have where what a useful concept of actually putting opioids, in this case, oxycodone, in a packaging, much like your Medrol dose pack or your azithromycin, and actually having a fixed amount and dispensing that. That actually constrains prescribing, it constrains use. And how does this change patient and prescribing outcomes? So that's essentially this randomized controlled crossover design where we have physicians starting off with the packaging prototype and then switching to usual care, and then another group of physicians starting with usual care and going to the packaging prototype. A lot of conversation about one thing I have to say I really love about the packaging prototype is that there is a panel on it that actually provides a space for you to put really important drug information, clinical information. So for example, warnings. There's a piece of the part of the panel that has some warning area where you can put things about opioids that you're really concerned about. Now, when a patient gets dispensed opioids now, they get a leaflet, but it can be separated from the package. So this actually puts critical information in with the packaging, and it makes it inseparable. But there's all kinds of aspects of the prototype design, and we actually submitted another FDA grant recently to unpack some of these, like the child-resistant features and so forth. Anyway, these are some, and we're doing this in orthopedic surgery. And basically the bottom line is our hypothesis will be more effective than an amber vial in reducing oxycodone prescribing. And I would even go so far as say possibly use among patients receiving treatment for post-orthopedic pain. So anyway, we have a number of surgeons. We mentioned the overall 2 phases where we have crossover design. And so this is really where we are. We have some eligibility criteria. We're doing this at UConn Health. And these are some aims that we're collecting. Again, looking at baseline, looking at, and then doing sort of, so one part of the study is looking at effectiveness, and another part of the study is looking at feasibility. So all our in-depth interviews and so forth are really looking at feasibility. And here's our wonderful number of tools that we're looking at. We're looking at, you know, one thing that's really nice about a packaging prototype is you can actually see the tablets that are removed. So you actually can say, hey, I didn't remove that tablet. Did Johnny take it? You know, so you might give you a little window on, you know, your use as well as someone else's taking it without your permission. So that's sort of where we are now. I just wanted to show you that this is the kind of design. So here you can see these are the where you can put some really, by the way, this is hot off the press, literally just got kind of, we also have a QR code here and we have a website link. So this is really, really helpful because we can actually give people resources through the website link. Here's that key information here. We've developed the website, and just interesting to put a QR code on these things. It's kind of a new piece. And then here's the cavities, and we number them. And actually what's not here is we actually have a place where they can indicate the start date. So that's a little bit about my journey, you know, building new conceptual frameworks, advancing the evaluation of pharmacists' roles in substance use disorder, the care of vulnerable populations, really promoting awareness of what patients, or rather what pharmacists and how prescribers and pharmacists can work together to target behaviors and looking at medication safety. So this is our last question. And there you go. And we'll hopefully have a moment for some quick questions. I highlighted patient outcome so that it made it clearer. All right, let's see how folks did on this one. Yeah, so we are not, prescriber communication about opioids is really maybe a prescriber outcome. Patient feedback about their opioid use experience is really not a main focus, but I would say the toughest part was between B and C. And so I'm glad to see most people picked C because that is indeed the correct answer. So again, little challenging with the reduced time, but a great effort. So I guess that leads us to our last slide here. I just usually like to thank all my mentors and the deans that have helped me get this research or to support this research, number of students, my project manager, and many of you know these folks. They're great colleagues. And here's my contact information. So I know we're really right at kind of time here, but I don't know if folks wanted to take a few moments and ask some questions. I don't know what you're seeing in the chat. I'm certainly willing to stay for a few minutes if folks wanted to do that. I'll leave it up to Madeline to guide us.
Yeah, we actually have one in the chat from Dr. Carroll. Was there a decreasing trend in opioid prescribing before the change in regulation? Could you look at trend analysis over time?
Yeah, and we had looked at like 6 months of data beforehand, and I'd have to go back and see if I think overall there has been a decrease in opioid prescribing prior. I assume you're talking about pre-guideline. Yeah, that's something we can definitely confirm, but I believe there was a decrease in prescribing. There certainly has been a decrease in prescribing in the state overall during that 2016, 2017 period and since then.
Yeah, that was the main thing I was worried about was like over time it's been coming down.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. So one really can't say with real good, can't say with precision that it had anything to do with that particular guideline that came out. Because it could be a number of interventions that were going on. Certainly seeing the decrease in search rates kind of give us some signal that there was something going on with the guideline. It's, as you know, this is messy, messy research. And that's why I've struggled getting this manuscript out the door, because I'm just kind of trying to figure out how to present it in a way that will be most useful for folks. A great question.
Thank you for that. Do we have any questions? Have any comments before we close?
I'll just add that so the FDA application we sent in a couple months ago is actually going to try to test 2 different child resistant features with the packaging prototype, 2 different types of patient information on they call this a billboard. We're also, so we're using, I don't know if I won't have time to get into it, but just so you folks, I can share something that I'm beginning to get interested in, but it's called the MOST strategy. I don't know if folks have heard of it, but the MOST strategy, it's called a multi-phased optimization strategy that they're using a lot in behavioral intervention type research. And I guess NIH and others are, but it allows you to optimize your intervention design and find which optimization is best, and actually do it in a way that you don't need a huge sample size.
Awesome. We have one more question. Do you think that academic feeling has potential in other topics?
What was that last part? The
Antihypertensives. Yeah, I'm sorry. There's an echo.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. By the way, academic detailing has been done in osteoporosis, in fall risks, all kinds of areas. So absolutely. And I was trained in academic detailing by Harvard's national, I forgot what it's called, NARCAD, but it's their resource center in academic detailing. It's a national organization. Anyway, really great opportunities there. Absolutely. Great.
Well, thank you for being here today. I don't have any other questions. I'm seeing lots of thanks in the chat, so I want to echo that. Once again. And yeah, if there are no other questions for us today. Thank you all for being here.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.